So now that we've completed the competition, the engineering competition, for the first time, I want to just kind of review some of the instructions before you start writing up your write-up. When I copied my example of the write-up into OneNote, kind of messed up the picture here a little bit. So, remember I was here. But regardless, basically this is a general outline of what your project should look like. You'll have a title. It can be a creative title, something that's, kind of funny and a play on words if you want, or just something that generally describes what you did. You'll have a picture of your project so that anybody else that looks at your project write-up can see what you did and what it looked like. You'll have a data table. If you only had one trial, like mine only had one trial here, I tested it for the number of weights held, you could just include who was in your group. If, for instance, you were doing the boat building and you had a couple different trials because each time that you tested it, you went and added some glue to some places or something like that, you might include a data table that looks like trial 1, 2, and 3, and the data for each one. Your data might be height in centimeters, it might be vertical drop in centimeters, it might be weight in grams. Whatever your units and unit of measure was, make sure to include that. So that gets us through the title, the picture, and the data table. This here, though, is our write-up. Now remember, this one's a little, it's definitely short because I didn't actually build the Golden Gate Bridge. I know, disappointing. But it should be 2 paragraphs in length, and it should cover, in general, 3 things. Those 3 things, I'm going to draw them or write them down here. One is your design, your process, and finally, the science. In the instructions, I divided this up into paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. That's a perfectly fine way to write it, and it makes sense. However, if we're explaining, this is kind of like what you did and why you chose that. A lot of times, that explanation of why you chose building your bridge or building the boat the way you did often has to relate directly to the science. So it's quite possible that as you're describing your design and the process that you took to build whatever your competition was, you might actually be talking a lot about the science. So you might have your science woven into your description of the design and the process, and that's totally fine. Regardless, your write-up should be 2 paragraphs in length, might be 3, there might be 3 short paragraphs or 4 short paragraphs, but it should basically be about half of the page, right? We want to give a good description of what the design, why you chose that design, how you built it, and the science behind it. That can be in 2 separate paragraphs or all woven together. The one thing I want to remind you not to do is don't tell me what I already know. What I mean by that is especially related to the materials. For instance, if you built a boat, you got 25 straws. You don't need to spend a sentence or 2 talking about the number of straws that you used and how you used hot glue. That's not worthwhile to include in this information because everybody uses hot glue and the 25 straws. If you're building the bridge and you got 50 popsicle sticks, you don't need to repeat the fact that you got 50 popsicle sticks and were able to use hot glue. That's going to be the same for everybody. The only one that this doesn't apply to is number 2, which is from A to B. Because this one is the engineering one where it says you have to move an object from the floor to the seat of a chair using any materials that you want. That's the only one where it makes sense to describe what materials you used, because the materials that one group used are going to be totally different from the materials that another group used because of your own individual design choices. So just a reminder to not tell me what I already know, specifically related to materials. The final thing that I wanted to talk about was if you're going to use other sources of information like the internet or Wikipedia or the textbook or anything, make sure to paraphrase. Remember that paraphrasing does not just mean changing a word or a phrase or flipping the order of a sentence. That's still technically plagiarism. So the thing that I suggest doing is, if this is your source, a lot of people go directly from the source to writing their report, right? Writing their 2 paragraphs. What I suggest having in between these is a set of notes. From you're reading the source and you jot down some notes. Literally just words, phrases, very short bullet points, not a lot of information, not the typical I'm rewriting half of the chapter kind of notes, but very brief to the point, just to remind you of words and ideas later when you're writing a report. Once you're done with those notes, put them away for a little bit. Do some other homework, come back to this the next day, etc. That way the wording and phrasing from the source doesn't still end up in your report. Once you come back to it a day later, use those notes to write up your report. In this way, you're going to end up with your own wording and your own phrasing, which is paraphrasing, and that way you avoid any plagiarism, whether it was intentional or accidental. So really, just to kind of recap everything, don't forget to have a title, a picture, data table. Your written summary will talk about design, process, and science. Those can be split up neatly into 2 paragraphs, or they can be woven together. Because as you're talking about your design and why you chose that design, the reasons might be the science. So they could all be, kind of interwoven together in a couple paragraphs. Don't tell me what I already know, specifically relating to materials, and make sure to paraphrase. Thank you.